Hey everyone, I'm Matt.
And I'm Saksham.
This is neuroplasticity as part of Rice Brainstem. So what is plasticity, right? So neuroplasticity, also known as neural plasticity or brain plasticity, is the ability of neural networks in the brain to change through growth and reorganization. These changes range from individual neuron pathways making new connections to systematic adjustments like cortical remapping. So the next logical question is what's learning? Because those two are pretty similar. Learning is the process of acquiring new understanding, knowledge, behaviors, skills, values, attitudes, and preferences. The ability to learn is possessed by humans, animals, and also some machines as well. There's also evidence that learning occurs in some plants as well. So how do we learn? Well, there are three main ways that humans learn, and also how animals learn as well. The first is classical conditioning, the second is operant conditioning, and the third is observation. When we learn through classical conditioning, this just means we learn through associating learning with a natural response, like hunger. Operant conditioning is when we associate learning with a reward that's not a natural response. For example, after you learn something, you're awarded a prize, like someone pays you, or you get a free iPhone or something. Something you like, but something that's not a natural response, like hunger. And then finally, there's observational learning, which is just when you learn based off of seeing someone perform that same act. So how does plasticity work? Plasticity, this is just how our neurons in the brain reorganize over time. So as we learn, our neurons don't stay the same. Pathways change. There are long-lasting functional changes that occur in the brain when we learn new things. And these changes that happen in the brain is just what we call neuroplasticity.
So there are multiple types of plasticity, and there are two specific types. The first one being structural plasticity. And so in this one, there are changes in the brain in response to the environment. And specifically, those changes are going to be structural changes. So the brain structure literally just changes shape and the neural connections that we have in our brain. And this helps us to better understand and function in our world. It's literally like your brain is learning to adapt to its own environment and helps you be better. And the second type is a functional plasticity. So in this one, it's a really special one where some parts of the brain, they take over functions of another part of the brain. And this usually happens because there's some type of damage to an area of the brain. And then because of that injury, the brain can sort of compensate for the loss of function because of that damage in the other part of the brain. So let's go into memory and forgetting. This is where learning really plays a bigger role, right? So memory can be defined as a process of taking in information from the outside world, storing it into our brain, and then later recalling the information to answer like a task, solve a problem, maybe make some type of decision that we have, or any other response that requires us to remember something. And so memory has three key parts to it. Right? The first one is called encoding, where we are acquiring information, we're processing that information. And so this involves the perception of a lot of things that are around us. The second one is consolidation, or otherwise known as storage. And so after an event is encoded, it has to be consolidated in some way, right? So the brain has to take that and do some type of physical and chemical changes inside the brain so that we can actually remember that information and sort of retain the information for a long period of time. And these changes in our brain are called memory traces. And then the last part of memory is called retrieval. So this is when we're actively recalling the information, when we're trying to remember something, right? We're trying to bring that information back to our mind. And so we have to access our stored information in order to respond to the world around us. And so this is where our memory comes into play, because that's sort of our capacity of storing and retrieving that information. So it's the entire process. And forgetting is sort of the opposite of that. It's kind of the undoing of remembering things, right? And so there is a biological process in the brain called synaptic pruning. And this is sort of the way that we end up forgetting things. And so basically what happens is that if we aren't using sort of the connections between our neurons to retrieve our memory, because that's what we sort of have when we're storing our memory, right? We're making more connections between our neurons. And we have to use those connections to remember stuff. So if we're not using those connections to retrieve memory, we end up actually losing the connections. And this can lead us to forget things. So there's example is that, when we're practicing something for a long period of time, like playing a song on the piano, for example, and we're doing it consistently, our brain is encoding the music, it's storing that music in our brain. And when we try to play that music by memory without looking at any sheet music, we're able to retrieve that information consistently and correctly at all times within a practice. But if we stop playing the piano for a long period of time and we aren't trying to remember the music that we had practiced for a long period of time, then we actually end up forgetting that stuff. And the reason why that's happening is because of this process of synaptic pruning. And that ends up breaking down the connections that actually helped us to memorize the piano song in the first place. So yeah, here's some works cited. And thank you for listening to our talk.
Thank you.